I cheated on my husband with the sexy cab driver, so before you judge me, read until the end to understand my reasons. I'll never forget that day I was running late for work. Traffic was impossible, and my boss had warned me that one more tardiness would mean my dismissal. Desperate, I ran out of the house without breakfast and dashed onto the street in search of a cab. After several failed attempts, one finally stopped. "Where to?" asked the cab driver with a warm smile. "The Skyline building, please, and if you could go as fast as possible, I'd really appreciate it," I replied hurriedly. The driver nodded and started the vehicle. As he skillfully navigated through traffic, I noticed him in the rearview mirror. He was about 35, with dark, slightly messy hair and brown eyes that conveyed serenity. "I'm Jack," he introduced himself suddenly. "Looks like you're having a rough day." His voice was pleasant and comforting. For some reason, I felt I could trust him. "I'm Sarah," I responded. "And yeah, if I'm late today, I'll probably get fired." Jack nodded understandingly. "Don't worry, Sarah. I promise we'll get there on time." During the ride, we chatted animatedly. Jack had this ability to make me forget my worries. He told me he'd been a cab driver for 5 years and loved his job because it allowed him to meet all kinds of people. I told him about my job at an advertising agency and how stressful it could be. When we arrived at my destination, I looked at the clock and sighed with relief. I still had 5 minutes to spare. "Thank you so much, Jack. You've saved my day," I said as I searched for money in my purse. "It's been my pleasure, Sarah," he replied with a smile that quickened my pulse. Without thinking twice, I leaned forward and gave him a kiss on the cheek. It was an impulsive gesture, but at that moment, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Jack looked surprised, but not displeased. "Have a good day," I said goodbye before running towards the office. Throughout the workday, I couldn't get Jack out of my head. His smile, his voice, the way he made me feel. It was absurd, I knew. I had been married for 3 years to Tom, my high school sweetheart. We had a stable relationship, although lately things weren't going as well as I'd like to admit. The following days passed normally, but every time I saw a cab pass by on the street, I couldn't help but look for Jack's face. A week later, I made an impulsive decision. I called the cab company and asked about him, making up a story about leaving something in his car. To my surprise and delight, I got his phone number. That same afternoon, with my heart racing, I sent him a message. "Hi, Jack. It's Sarah, the girl you took to the Skyline building last week. I was wondering if you'd like to grab a coffee sometime." The response came almost immediately. "Hi, Sarah. Of course I remember you. I'd love to have that coffee. How about tomorrow afternoon?" We met at a cafe near my work. When I arrived, Jack was already there, with his characteristic smile. We talked for hours as if we'd known each other all our lives. He told me about his passion for photography, his dream of traveling the world capturing unique moments. I told him about my love for painting, something I had set aside since I got married. From that day on, we started seeing each other regularly, always with the excuse of having a coffee or taking a walk in the park. Each encounter intensified my feelings for him. Jack was attentive, fun, and made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. One day, as we were walking in the park, the tension between us became unbearable. We looked into each other's eyes, and without a word, we kissed. It was a passionate kiss, full of pent-up desire. When we separated, we both knew we had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. "This is wrong," I whispered, though without real regret in my voice. "I know," Jack replied, "but it feels so right." From that moment on, our encounters became more frequent and passionate. We would meet in his cab, parked in discreet places. The back seat became our little refuge, where we gave free rein to our passion. My marriage to Tom was deteriorating more each day. I came home late, made up excuses to go out, acted distant. He noticed something was going on, but I didn't dare confess the truth to him. One afternoon, Jack picked me up in his cab as usual. But this time, instead of going to our usual spot, he took me to his apartment. It was a small but cozy place, full of photographs he had taken himself. "I wanted you to see my space," he said with a certain shyness. That night we made love for the first time in a bed. It was intense, passionate, different from anything I had experienced before. As we lay embraced afterward, I realized I was falling hopelessly in love with Jack. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. My life had become an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, there was the excitement and passion of my relationship with Jack. On the other, the guilt and remorse for cheating on Tom. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks. Back to the story. One morning, I woke up feeling nauseous. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when the symptoms persisted for several days, I began to suspect. I took a pregnancy test and the result was positive. Panic overtook me. Whose baby was it? It had been weeks since I'd been intimate with Tom, so the odds pointed to Jack. The news hit me like a hammer. I was pregnant with the cab driver's baby, the man I'd been cheating on my husband with. I spent entire days debating what to do. Should I tell Tom? Jack? Should I end everything and start over somewhere else? The options overwhelmed me. Finally, after much reflection, I decided I had to be honest. I couldn't keep living a lie. Tom deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One night, when Tom came home from work, I asked him to sit down and talk. With my heart in my throat, I told him everything. I told him about Jack, how we started seeing each other, how I had fallen in love with him. And finally, I told him I was pregnant and that the baby was probably not his. Tom remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with pain and disappointment. Why, Sarah? What did I do wrong? His words broke my heart. You didn't do anything wrong, Tom. It was me. I lost myself somewhere in our marriage and didn't know how to find myself again. We talked for hours. We cried, we shouted, we hugged. In the end, we came to the painful conclusion that our marriage was over. We agreed to separate amicably, and Tom asked for time to process everything before making decisions about the future. With a heavy heart, but feeling that I was finally being honest with myself, I called Jack the next day. I asked him to meet me at our usual cafe. When I arrived, Jack was already there with his usual smile. But that smile vanished when he saw my serious expression. What's wrong, Sarah? He asked, concerned. I took a deep breath and dropped the news. I'm pregnant, Jack, and the baby is yours. His face went through a series of emotions in a matter of seconds. Surprise, fear, and finally, something that looked like joy? Wow, he finally said. That's unexpected. I told him about my conversation with Tom and our decision to separate. Jack listened attentively, holding my hand across the table. And what do you want to do? He asked when I finished speaking. I don't know, I admitted. But I know I want you, Jack. I want to try to build something with you if that's what you want too. Jack smiled and kissed me softly. Of course that's what I want, Sarah. I want you and I want this baby. The following months were an emotional roller coaster. The divorce from Tom was painful but civilized. We promised to maintain a cordial relationship for everyone's sake. Jack and I started living together. We decorated the baby's room together, chose names, made plans for the future. It seemed that despite all the difficulties, I had finally found my place in the world. However, as the due date approached, I began to notice changes in Jack. He became more distant, spent more time away from home. When I asked, he always had excuses: extra work, a friend who needed help, a family emergency. One night, when I was 8 months pregnant, Jack came home late. His hair was messy and he smelled of women's perfume. My heart sank. Where have you been? I asked, although deep down I already knew the answer. Jack avoided my gaze. Sarah, I'm sorry. There's someone else. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything we'd been through, after I had left my previous life for him, Jack was cheating on me. Who is she? I managed to ask through tears. Her name is Amanda. She's a passenger I met a few months ago, Jack admitted. I didn't want this to happen, Sarah, but it did, and I think I'm in love with her. I felt as if the world was crumbling around me. All the happiness I had felt in recent months evaporated in an instant. I realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life. "Leave," I said with a trembling voice. "Leave and don't come back." Jack tried to say something else, but I interrupted him. "Out," I shouted with all my might. That night, as I cried in the bed I had until recently shared with Jack, I felt the baby move in my belly. I put my hand on it and whispered, "It'll just be you and me, little one. I promise I'll love you enough for both of us." The following days were a blur of sadness and regret. I felt used, betrayed, as if the universe was laughing at me. I had left my husband, had risked everything for what I believed was true love, only to discover it was another lie. Tom, despite all the pain I had caused him, was surprisingly understanding when I told him what had happened. He even offered to help me with the baby if I needed it. His kindness only made me feel worse for having hurt him. As the due date approached, I immersed myself in preparations. I bought everything necessary for the baby, attended childbirth classes, and tried to keep busy to avoid thinking about Jack or the mess my life had become. One afternoon, while I was organizing the baby's room, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a young, beautiful woman. "Hello," she said nervously. "I'm Amanda. I needed to talk to you." My first instinct was to slam the door in her face, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe masochism. I invited her in. Amanda sat on the couch, wringing her hands. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't know Jack was with you when we started seeing each other. He told me he was single." Her words were like a slap. Jack had not only cheated on me, but he had also deceived Amanda. I laughed bitterly. "Seems like we were both victims of his lies," I told her. Amanda nodded with tears in her eyes. "When I found out the truth, I ended things with him immediately. But I felt I owed you an explanation, an apology." We sat in silence for a moment, two women united by the deceit of a man we thought we loved. "Thank you for coming," I finally said. "It wasn't your fault." Amanda left shortly after, leaving me with a strange sense of closure. I was no longer angry with her. All my anger was directed at Jack and at myself for having been so naive. 2 weeks later, I went into labor. It was long and painful, but when I finally held my daughter in my arms, all the pain and anguish of the past few months vanished. She was perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and the same brown eyes as her father. I named her Hope because that's what she represented for me. The hope of a new beginning, of a better future. As I held my daughter in the hospital room, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had made mistakes, I had hurt people who loved me, and I had been hurt in turn. But looking at Hope, I knew that all of it had been worth it if it had brought me to her. The first few months with Hope were exhausting but wonderful. Every smile, every little achievement was a source of infinite joy. I immersed myself completely in motherhood, leaving behind the pain of the past. Jack tried to contact me several times after Hope's birth. As Hope grew, so did I. I learned to forgive myself for past mistakes. I understood that love can take many forms, and that sometimes second chances come from where you least expect them. One day, when Hope was almost a year old, I received an unexpected call. It was Jack. "Sarah," he said, his voice charged with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask you anything, but could I meet Hope? I understand if you say no, but I had to try." I remained silent for a moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to refuse, to keep Jack out of our lives forever. But another part, the part that had matured and grown in the last year, knew that Hope deserved to know her father, regardless of what had happened between us. "Okay," I finally said. "We can meet at the park this Saturday." At that moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I had fallen in love with, and I felt a pang of nostalgia for what could have been. After that day, Jack became a constant presence in Hope's life. He wasn't the full-time father I had once imagined, but he made an effort to be present in important moments. Over time, I managed to forgive Jack, not for him, but for myself and for Hope. I understood that holding grudges would only hurt me and my daughter. Tom continued to be an invaluable support. His friendship became one of the pillars of my life, and he helped me rediscover parts of myself that I had forgotten. Little by little, I started painting again, finding in art a way to process everything I had lived through. As hope grew, so did I. I learned that love can take many forms, and that sometimes second chances come from where you least expect them. My relationship with Tom slowly evolved from friendship to something more. It wasn't the burning passion I had felt with Jack, but a deeper love based on mutual respect and understanding. One day, as I watched Hope play in the park with Tom, I realized that I had found the happiness I had always sought. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what I had imagined, but it was real and it was mine. I looked back on the path that had led me here. The cab on that fateful day, the passionate affair with Jack, the painful divorce, the betrayal, Hope's birth, and finally, the slow but sure rebirth of my relationship with Tom. Every step, every mistake, every moment of pain and joy had led me to this point. And as I watched my daughter laugh in the arms of the man I had learned to love again, I knew I wouldn't change a thing. My story hadn't ended as I expected when I got into that cab years ago. It had been a journey full of unexpected turns, emotional ups and downs, moments of doubt and clarity, but in the end, it had taken me exactly where I needed to be. Hope ran towards me, her little arms outstretched, her laughter filling the air. I picked her up and hugged her tight, feeling the unconditional love that only a child can give. Tom approached, surrounding both of us with his arms. At that moment, surrounded by the love of my rebuilt family, I understood that sometimes the happy ending isn't the one we imagine at the beginning. Sometimes it's the result of our mistakes, our struggles, and our growth. And that makes it even more valuable. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues, I realized that my story of love, betrayal, and redemption had come to an end. But a new story, full of promises and possibilities, was just beginning. And this time, I was ready to live it fully, with open eyes and a heart full of gratitude for the lessons learned and the love found in the most unexpected places. As we walked home, Hope between Tom and me holding our hands, I knew that no matter what the future held for us, we would be okay, because we had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true love, the kind that endures, isn't always the most passionate or dramatic. Sometimes it's the one that grows slowly, that survives the storms and flourishes in the calm that comes after. And so, with a full heart and a peaceful soul, I ventured into the next chapter of my life, grateful for the journey that had brought me here and excited for what was to come. As we entered our home, the sound of Hope's laughter echoing through the rooms, I caught Tom's eye. He smiled at me, a smile full of understanding and love. In that moment, I knew that this was where I belonged. That night, as I tucked Hope into bed, I whispered to her, "Life doesn't always go as planned, sweetheart, but sometimes the detours lead us to the most beautiful destinations." I joined Tom on the porch where we often sat in the evenings, watching the stars come out. He took my hand, his touch familiar and comforting. "You know," he said, "I never thought we'd end up here." I thought about Jack, hoping he had found his own path to happiness. I thought about Amanda, grateful for her honesty that day. And I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who had stepped into that fateful cab, not knowing how it would change her life. If I could, I would tell her that love isn't always what you expect it to be. That sometimes it's messy and complicated. That it can hurt you, but it can also heal you in ways you never imagined. And that true happiness often comes from embracing the imperfect, beautiful reality of life, rather than chasing an idealized fantasy. As the night grew deeper, Tom and I made our way back inside. I paused at Hope's room, watching her sleep peacefully. In her face, I could see traces of Jack, of myself, but also something uniquely her own. She was a testament to the unexpected gifts life can bring, even from our biggest mistakes. Crawling into bed beside Tom, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I also knew that we were strong enough to face them together. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled to myself. My story wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. It was messy and complicated and beautiful, and it was mine. In the end, isn't that what life is all about? Not the perfect, polished stories we tell ourselves, but the raw, authentic experiences that shape us, challenge us, and ultimately lead us to where we're meant to be. And as I closed my eyes, wrapped in the warmth of Tom's embrace, with Hope sleeping soundly in the next room, I knew that this imperfect, unexpected, wonderful life was exactly where I was meant to be.